All right, may I propose that we reconvene and start again. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Professor Beatrice from Utrecht University. She is originally a historian. She does way more things than just historical things these days, but is originally a historian, now also a security and terrorism researcher, also anthropologist in a way, at least doing anthropological research. She focuses on how states and societies can aim at securing security, or securing high levels of security, and how these attempts embody different kinds of values that are core to our society, such as democracy, freedom, rule of law, responsible government, and so on. She also leads the Secure project, Securing Europe, so that's an ERC consolidated grant, I believe. And maybe I would like to draw particular attention to a book that was published earlier this year that she wrote in Dutch Radicalization, so Radical Redemption. We will hear more about that, I think, in a minute or so, which is a detailed account of what terrorists believe based on a relatively large number of interviews that she did with jihadi terrorists mostly, or those who were planning to commit such acts. So again, we will hear more about that in a second. Well, there are too many prizes to mention. NW Staven Prize, a member of the KNAW, and so on. By the way, we had a book symposium earlier this year, I think August 23rd, on this book, and I think by now it is online. So if your Dutch is okay, please look it up on the website. But if not, I'm sure we will hear more about this today. And now that we're speaking about it, I happen to know that the book has also been translated. A manuscript is pretty much ready, and hopefully that will be out pretty soon. And one more comment on that from me towards the end of this conference. So thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rick, for your generous introduction, and thank you to Rick's colleagues, Rut and Naomi and Nora and everyone else who makes this possible. Very happy to try and combine different conceptual angles, different disciplinary methods in making sense of extreme beliefs. And I'm bringing indeed here onto the field my own historical, conceptual and fieldwork analysis of what terrorist believes. And I'm trying to do that today based on a paper that I also wrote with Kees van der Bos on social appraisals. So I will bring something in from that paper in my talk today. Approaching the religious dimension in radicalization processes, that is what I do. And that's still a hotly debated issue. There are macro-level approaches regarding structural, natural, socio-economic conditions. There are micro-level approaches that focus on coping, on appraisal, on individual conditions, but they cannot adequately explain radical behavior, radical beliefs of members or of extreme religious groups. Instead, in this paper that, as I said, I partly wrote with Kees van der Bos, we propose that meso-level approaches best explain religious beliefs and their role in radicalization processes. And my paper is based on interviews and accounts of jihadist detainees and former convicts in the Netherlands and Indonesia. In March 2019, terror erupted in the city of Utrecht, where I live and work. 4 people were killed, 6 others were injured, and the perpetrator was a 37-year-old Gökmen Tanes, a Turkish migrant who had a history of violence and alcohol abuse. And in the periods between addictions and criminal spells, he focused on Islamic faith, and witnesses heard him saying Allahu Akbar while shooting at innocent people taking the tram. Tanis fled the scene of the mass shooting, but he left behind a letter that was found in a car that read, "I am doing this for my religion. Your guys are killing Muslims and want to take my religion away from me. You will not succeed in that. Allah is great." Tanis committed this attack on the Monday after the weekend when Brenton Tarrant killed 51 Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand. And Tanis indicated, he was captivated and indicated later in court, that this had been an important trigger for his acts. He wanted to take revenge, he wanted to take action, do something good, given the fact that he had a life of crime and sin, and now felt that the moment had come to do something back. We were shocked to see what happened in our city. There was huge debate on what exactly motivated Tanis. Was he deranged? Was he a lunatic? Did he do it for his religion? What happened here? And this is something that I also set out in my book to discover. I'm using a number of definitions, and I know part of the project here at stake is that we will redefine and rethink the current definitions that are out there and make them as open and transparent and as good as they possibly can be. When I set out with my work, I used a more matter-of-fact, pragmatist approach, and I used the definitions that are being wielded as the instruments in defining people as terrorists or as extremists or as radicals by the state, by the Dutch National Counterterrorism Office, and also by the international definitions that are out there. And if you take as a starting point, in as much as you may agree or disagree with them, but it is the starting point that defines the space where people are being prosecuted and being convicted for terrorism, these are the definitions that are in use. Definitions on extremism, definitions on radicalization, terrorism, and the fundamentalist definition is and was not in the NCTV definitions list. So I took Kassam and Peel's work to come up with a definition on fundamentalism, sort of a preliminary definition because they're still working on it. But the first three are the ones that are defined by the NCTV. And I think it's important to point out that radicalization, in the words of the NCTV, is a process of increased willingness to accept the extreme consequences of a set of beliefs and put it into action. So there's beliefs and there's action. This increased willingness can lead to behavior that deeply hurts or affects other people's freedom, can lead individuals or groups to turn away from society, can lead to the use of violence. You can see it's very much from a public administration perspective that these definitions are formulated. So, if you take these definitions as a starting point and you go to the prisons and you see what people are apprehended and convicted for terrorism there, you can still try and start to make sense of what actually drove and motivated them. And let me briefly walk past the levels of analysis that are being used today in making sense of such behavior, of what these people have been convicted for. First of all, theories on religion and radicalization into violent extremism and terrorism often focus on a macro level of analysis. These theories try to explain and map processes of radicalization by means of structural factors in society, zooming in on variables such as the occurrence of poverty, discrimination, exclusion in given states or societies, a context of war, or a context of failed states. As you can see, this is a normative approach, but approaches can completely differ. In the more critical studies approach, radicalization is being discarded and it's being blamed for obscuring or obfuscating the fact that it's discriminatory against specific groups, but it's still a macro level approach. There's also the other part, the more state-led part, where people try to make sense of radicalization and try to think of solutions. If you invest more in education, if you invest more in anti-discrimination programs, perhaps then radicalization will stop. So it's both normative, it's both geared towards taking action into this field, but it's very much established on a macro level of analysis. National culture theory, for example, provides insight in how collective cultures promote the tendency to form in-groups and out-groups in a society, and how individualistic cultures actually generate violence within their own group. And within this type of theory, some studies do foreground religion, and they operationalize it in terms of religious representation, religious narratives, the existence of apocalyptical creeds as fuel for radical groups on a more larger societal level. Mark Jugendsmeyer is the most recent and influential exponent of this type of analysis. You could also say these are root cause theories. Yet, while appropriating religion as a root cause for radicalization, so the blanket fact that there is an apocalyptical or radical religion at hand may prompt radicalization, these theories oftentimes fail to operationalize and explain a transition from absolute conditions in society to actual precipitating factors to attacks as those, for example, that happened in Utrecht in 2019. So instead of taking the factual state of a social economic oppression, the factual state of religion, studies have demonstrated that there is far more to it. You need to have a kind of a carrier, a more meso-level mechanism. But first, the micro-level perspective. So I think I made it clear that in my work, the macro-level factors are not enough. As such, they need a chain of translation, a chain of interpretation in order to understand the reservoirs of larger scale narratives, larger scale cultural theories, cultural ideals, and how they translate into concrete extreme beliefs for groups or for individuals. Let's take the individual perspective, the micro-level approach. In order to properly understand processes underlying causal relations between religion and radicalization, we do, of course, need a closer and more focused look on individual psychological factors, because most believers do not turn radical, do not turn into terrorists, do not even turn into fundamentalists. So a closer, more focused look on individual factors, motivational beliefs, is necessary. And there is a spate of recent articles and books that work hard to offer convincing framework to do this. And the most recent framework in trying to make sense of the religious factor and radicalization, that is, for example, the work of Gohl, Charbonneau, Clark, Grant, and Scholdes. I listed a few of them. And what they do, for example, they come up with psychological coping theories, in which they say that religious coping strategies, religious appraisals are of a typical value within these coping approaches. Taylor, Newton, and McIntosh, for example, they propose that religious beliefs act as a cognitive scheme, shaping cognitive processes, including the perception of stress, through something that is called a transactional model. So the coping is provided by this transactional model. Cognitive appraisals are the intermediaries between beliefs and coping strategies. For example, belief in a just and a benevolent God correlates with surrendering control to that God, which in turn leads to less psychological distress when coping with uncontrollable negative events. And this approach has also been tested in the field of radicalization. There's another approach, the moral superiority approach by van Stekelenburg. She describes radicalization as a process towards increasing acceptance of violence, which explains extremist behavior and exclusion of other groups, because radical groups have interpreted anger eliciting situation and reappraised them from a position of moral superiority. They make the attribution that the outgroup is moral inferior and needs to be eliminated based on a reappraisal fueled by the emotion of contempt. So superiority and contempt as a mode of coping with stressful situations, feelings of injustice. But that leads me to the question that you can only start to really work with individual coping strategies if you combine this with theories on social identity and on social identity narratives. Research has demonstrated that radicalization is influenced by personal existential feelings of uncertainty, injustices. That's all true, but they need to be transformed into injustice frames, into religious beliefs and narratives in order to trigger behavior. An appraisal and a corresponding action is a kind of a dynamic process, but it's a process that is dynamical in time. It evolves. It's a storyline that's happening. And that brings me to the meso-level approach. Finding acceptance in religious groups provides protection from perceived threat and buffering of social occlusion. That's what social psychologists say, and that's what Kees van der Bos has extensively written about. Perceived collective support for your identity belief can motivate a group member in developing superior behavior, more aggressive behavior, and then point to other people that need to be punished, for example. And there is a strong association between radicalized religious beliefs and ideologies and violent behaviors, suggesting that individual coping and appraisal carriers, that I just talked about, that they need narrative carriers, such as social discourses of threat, discourses of injustice, salvation, and significance. And these processes, and this is the reason why the meso-level is so important, they often take place in groups or in social context, either offline groups, churches, religious groups, sects, or online contexts. hubs, networks on the web. So the individual's need for coping with uncertainty needs to be tied to the social supply of ideological and religious narratives and beliefs. And social psychological research has demonstrated how people's motivation and cognition indeed assist them in goal attainment. Kruglenski's goal systems theory has established a threefold interface between cognition, motivation, and action. And that is where my research sets on, because this trias, the trias that Kruglenski spelled out, the cognition, the motivation, and the action needs to be narrated, it needs to be appropriated, it needs to be lived, and it needs to be expressed in order to persuade others of the reason what you're doing. So far the theory. But now over to the more practical research. If this is the theory, how do we then see the social psychological mechanisms that I just described, the emotions, the cognitions, the motivations? How do we see that alive in practice in the real world? Well, one angle where we could start is the research done by the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence that studied motives for foreign fighters joining IS. And what they found out is that for many radicalizing youngsters and foreign fighters who went to join the caliphate, seeking redemption in extremist religious beliefs was an important reported motive. So the people interviewed reported themselves about the necessity to seek redemption in extreme beliefs. There's a report, quite objective, descriptive report that prompted me in thinking further about this. And then if you take a number of recent attacks and look more closely in how the perpetrators, from the first-person perspective, describe their motivations themselves or try to seek justice or legitimize their motivation. You never know if it's the original intent, of course, or the post hoc justification of it, but still it's something that they believe in and they held dear enough to vocalize afterwards. For example, take David Samboli, who killed victims in Munich, Abdullah Ansarov, the murderer of Samuel Paty, a number of other attacks. And what stood out in these attacks? These were young male operators, lone operators. They were perhaps lone operators, but subscribed to a larger online web or network of beliefs. They also reported, or people around them reported, that these perpetrators felt chosen, called, singled out. Most of them had form, reflected on the fact that they had form, and said that they wanted to purify themselves, and even that they want to earn some recognition, or perhaps even earn some points. So again, seeking redemption, doing something for a larger audience with a purpose, you can see a narrative building up here. If you go further back in history, as I do oftentimes, I write and I teach about terrorism in history, there's the grand old lady of the history of terrorism, Martha Crenshaw, and she also wrote in her book Terrorism in Context about the incentive of redemption that's present when violent groups adhere to a strict moral religious code that offers individual participants radical roads to salvation. It's not the passive, it's not the cognitive, the reflective road to salvation, it's a very active road to salvation. And Martha Crenshaw also pointed in her work to the role of religiously informed extreme practices and narratives. And here again, I thought we need to take this more seriously as a set of extreme beliefs, as a set of extreme practices, but also as a mechanism, a narrative as a mechanism, tying the social appraisals to the radicalization. So what I did then, as you know, historians are sort of the profession of people who were not really taught a specific profession, but feel that everything that's in the past belongs to their discipline, so they can appropriate and do everything they like. So that's why I went out shopping for a kind of a theory that made this connection for me, the connection between narratives, dynamic narratives in time, contextualized narratives, and radicalization, and how that plays out in people's minds and also on a group level. And that I found with Dan McAdams' research on the redemptive self. It's a psychological type of research, social psychological type of research. It's not theological, nor is it philosophical, but it makes use of the philosophical and the theological notions that are out there in the culture, and the macro level approach, but it tries to come up with the missing link, how that affects and prompts people to act. And McAdams came up with the theory of the redemptive self that I have defined as a narrative of redemption in stories people tell themselves in order to improve their lives and atone for previous sins or shortcomings. And there's two kinds of narratives that are played out. The narrative of redemption, but there is also an inadvertent and unwittingly a narrative of contamination. I will touch upon that later. Very briefly, what is redemption? If we encounter the word redemption in different reports and different stories, what do people mean by this? Well, if you look it up in the dictionary, at least in the English dictionary, it has these two notions. It has the second notion of something indeed very transactional, very financial, to redeem one's mortgage. You pay money and you pay off your debts by that. But it also has this action of saving, being saved from sin, error, and evil. It's a deep notion in the Christian culture. But it's not just there in the Christian culture. I'll talk about this briefly later. It's also there, salvation, salvific deeds, atonement. It's also there in the other monotheistic and even the polytheistic creeds. But let's take McAdams first, because he came up with this theory, which is of course very much grafted onto the Christian, the deeply Christianized culture in the United States. He interviewed hundreds of Americans, and he asked them to tell him their life story. And he noted, it was not something that he set out to do, but he found out that people have specific patterns in telling you their life story. You can test it in your own circle of friends. It's not that people do it in a similar way. Some people will just narrate a couple of facts. Some people will just single out some big events in their life. But some people really kind of project a story onto their life, a story of finding significance. And McAdams says it's even more than that. It's finding significance in redeeming past shortcomings. And they can be told, this narrative of redemption can be told in different ways. It can be told in very strict religious language, the sin to forgiveness, which is the very much Christian Calvinistic interpretation of it, can also be done in a kind of an enlightenment variety. The emancipation, the enlightenment variety, the educational variety. So you say, I was illiterate, I came from very poor background, I couldn't even read when I was still an adult, and then I saw the light, I found a teacher, someone helped me, and from ignorance I made a leap to knowledge. So it's a story of the growth of the mind, a story of insight, discovery, against all odds, against the obstacles. It's also very much there in a medical way. People sometimes tell you their story of their life, how they fought cancer, survived the cancer, and now, and that's the point of McAdams. And they tell you these stories because they found significance in it in order to steer their lives in the here and now in a better direction. So they use these stories, these people that tell the stories, in order to improve their lives and steer them towards new types of actions, more generative actions, McAdams call it. So they become more charitable, they become more generous, more active towards others, more empathetic perhaps, because they've seen the light. Well, the leap here is that this is something that I encountered in the interviews that I did and I conducted with apprehended terrorist convicts and convicted terrorist detainees. So people were apprehended, some people were still, the trials were still out there. Most of them were indeed convicted, were engaged into serious terrorist crimes that made them have to stay in prison for longer than 3 or 4 years. So they really did something there. And they also told me stories in this fashion. So this is how I arrived at the idea. You may try to combine redemptive narratives with the social appraisals approach in the field of radicalization. Why? Because if you talk to terrorists, they do not describe themselves as terrorists. Hardly anyone ever does. Right-wing, left-wing, jihadists, they don't. So what they do is they try to tell you the story of why they were called, why they were chosen, why they felt singled out to do something for others, for their ummah, to take revenge. So it can be very negative, it can be very aggressive, but oftentimes the way in which they clad their motives, and you have to remember that most of them were already convicted, so that they didn't have to convince me, they were already there, so they didn't have to convince the judge. It's the way they give a reckoning about their lives, and sometimes you can also trace these narratives back to the protocols that the police wrote down in having made the interviews with the convicts. So it's not just that I took for granted what they told me afterwards. I also went back into their histories, into their past, and talked to their parents, etc., in trying to calibrate, of course, these narratives. What you can see is that the radical redemptive narrative was there, and in the mindset of the terrorist convicts had something altruistic to it. So it could be both. It could be taking revenge, Kok Mentanus taking revenge on democracy, on the Dutch society, but also doing something for his community, for the believers. They were wiped out and killed in Christchurch, and he now needed to make up for that. So it also has something altruistic to it from the terrorist point of view, of course. So summing up, radical redemption is an extreme and a fundamentalist belief narrative that functions as a cultural worldview. This view shapes cognition and appraisals of certain stressful situations. It steers emotions of anger, emotions of remorse, emotions of bliss even. The narrative provides guidance and facilitates mobilization, taking action, and it's therefore a distinctive cognitive and emotional, both affective, motivational belief, complementary to revenge, renown, and reaction. These three R's are oftentimes considered to be the main families of motivations that are allegedly guiding terrorists or violent extremists. So my point is, I'm going to add this fourth type of emotion, the radical redemption, motivational belief, which is both cognitive and emotional, because there's more to it than just revenge. There's also this altruistic motive. It's not just that they wanted to become world famous. Most of them didn't. They wanted to go and fight, but not necessarily become famous in the Netherlands. Some even changed their names. And they do want to elicit a reaction, but not always on the front line of their motivations. Well, and the tragedy of this is that this feeling, the idea of radical redemption, is something that was shaped, that was perhaps even reinvented, reappropriated by the meso-level group of the caliphate, the network of the caliphate. So within the context of jihadist views on sin, redemption, and salvation, the caliphate, the frontline thinkers of the caliphate, they designed a kind of a recruitment campaign, an appeal to exactly this notion of radical redemption. You can see it played out here. This is a still from a video clipping that the caliphate put out and disseminated through the world. And it says, sometimes people with the worst pasts create the best futures. Because those people are experienced, they know about crime, they know how to shoot, they know how to drive a four-wheel machine. But that's not the only reason. It's also with the worst past, you have the incentive, you have the motivation to become a better man and to do the things that you previously did for your own egotistical needs and desires. You're now going to do them for Allah, for the Muslims out there. And in the Big 2014, it's the glossy magazine run by IS, just when it created the caliphate, or pronounced the caliphate, it says, the truth is you're all sinners. Because deep down you know what you're doing and you are not changing. You spin around in circles, you know, I'm actually Muslim in my heart, I'm a Muslim in my heart, the true faith is in my heart. But you're not doing that, you're not turning their heads. So where are you where children are being murdered? Where are you? So you can see here that's a very clever, a very practical, down-to-earth. So it doesn't read, it doesn't show verses of the Surah from the Quran. It doesn't show hadith from past century imams. It's a very pragmatic, a very practical, down-to-earth approach. You are a sinner and you need to come out of your comfort zone and help us, because then you will be made whole again. You're leading your so-called gangster life, so the caliphate is also really playing to this crime-terror nexus conundrum. This is the data collection that I based my grounded theory in radical redemption on. So what I try to do is I try to find these patterns of radical redemption, interview inmates, talk to them about their motivational beliefs, and make sense of how they legitimize, how they explain their narrative of finding redemption in radical actions. I spoke to a number of jihadists in the Netherlands. Not all of them had a Dutch passport. Some of them in Indonesia. I spoke to far more, but not all gave me permission to use their life stories and put them in my book. I started the same way Dan McAdams did, with the life histories approach, so focusing on the sequence of events in someone's life and how this person tries to make sense of it. Check their attitude to violence, check their attitude to atonement, gratification, validation, and came up with this grounded theory. My grounded theory approach combines inductive and deductive research. Inductive means that the research has an open and flexible structure following the accounts as the detainees tell them, thus generating accessible and structured data. Deductive implies placing that data in a more systematic framework, the framework of social appraisals and the redemptive self, verifying it and using it to form a theory. Historians will recognize here the combination of oral history, primary source study, legal dossiers and more, and secondary research. With this data collected, I try to tell the story of relationships, parallels, the stories of radicalization process, the process of going to the caliphate. You have to bear in mind that I did this project based on people who actually went to Syria, or at least tried to go to Syria. So they were, they already crossed that boundary. And the following three elements could be identified in the case of almost all radicalizing individuals. It's first of all a sense of moral deficit, reported notion of shortcoming about one's own life, shortcoming about the way Muslims lived in the Netherlands, a feeling of deficit in the sense that the parents didn't live up to the expectations, they were not being good Muslims, or they themselves just sat in front of the television and didn't do anything, whereas in Syria, little children were put to their death by Assad. Then there is a decision to accept the fact that they held an individual responsibility, a sense of calling, a personal responsibility for the deficits, the shortcomings, the injustices that were out there. But it's not just a sense of injustice. That's oftentimes is the word. We had this discussion yesterday, Professor Kassam, that there are grievances out there. But it's not just the grievance out there, the feeling that the state or Assad or the leading imams, that they're not doing their job. It's also very much a personalized, a kind of perceived culpability that I am myself not worthy. I am myself responsible for this state of affairs. So it's a combination of agency and communion. My personal agency belongs to the communion of my fellow believers that are being oppressed, suppressed, and I need to do something. And then it's the third step. It's not always completely linear. People go to it in haphazard jumps and lapses, but it's a kind of how do you say it, a narrative sequence of events, the surrender to struggle. And that's the transition to action, where the set of notions of deficits, the notions of shortcomings, the desire to redeem or atone, also for one's own criminal past, for example, becomes a jump into action. Enacting redemption via battle, via augmented reality, via support online, via collecting goods, via wiring money. It could take different forms. And almost all of the interviews spoke of the absence and the search for meaning in their lives, general experiences, but this was also linked to frustration about injustice, as I said, desire to identify who caused it. And this sense of moral deficit was one of the overarching starting points, the triggers for their processes of radicalization. All of the interviews then placed their feelings of frustration, their feelings of deficit into a context of a greater project. And that's also important. There's the motivation, the quest for significance, that legitimizes, enables an epistemic community. There's the group dynamic, a recognition within the group, online or offline. And that sort of engenders the cultural worldview in which these individuals, and in which also the caliphate is the pull and the push factor both. It's the individual and the group that establish a relation in finding radical redemption. And this is the tricky part. How does this play into existing religious reservoirs of narratives? Because that's perhaps one of the most important reasons why religious radicalization is such a strong type of radicalization. It's an intense type of radicalization, also why it is such a globalized type of radicalization. You see similar patterns. That's why I did this research in the Netherlands and in Indonesia, and also indirectly in Cameroon a little bit. You find similar patterns, similar stories of radicalization, because the world is a globalized state of affairs, but because also, I already mentioned in the discussion before, the work of Azam. The work of Azam is being disseminated, distributed by Wahhabis, Saudi clergymen throughout the world. It's translated into Bahasa Indonesia, and you can find it in many mosques in Indonesia, many madrasas, many schools. That's where the jihadists that I interviewed in Indonesia came across these notions. It's translated for them. It was there. It was given to them. As it was, it's also there on the internet. It's everywhere. Thomas Heckhammer, an important terrorism researcher, wrote a book about especially Azam's work. And he also explains that this is perhaps one of the most globalized merchandised books, stories, life stories, experiences as broadcasted by the global jihadist movement worldwide. But what it does is that it kind of hijacks bandwagons on ancient old Islamic notions of iman, true faith, of liberation and salvation in God, of improvement, improving oneself, of purification, tazkiyah, atonement, kafara. You can imagine that if you have this reservoir of ideas, of notions, of theological beliefs, of practices, of seeking for an orthopraxis, that if you are able to kind of twitch and turn it into your direction, give it a more jihadist imprint, that it's much stronger than when you have to start from scratch. You can do that. Very brief elaboration here. You can find redemption in a more secularized fashion, political religions. Lenin was already mentioned by Professor Kassam. There is proletarian redemption via class struggle, revolution. What you see here, it's the 10 Commandments translated into socialist, communist German language by the German Democratic Republic. So the socialist citizen needed to stick to these commandments to purify his life and rinse all the capitalist residue from it and become a better person, and also to redeem society from capitalist sabotage and what have you. So it's there as well. It's also in anarchism. This is, you can imagine, I collected throughout history a lot of case studies where also parallel, similar-like notions of redemption are being voiced. For example, this one, Auguste Vaillant, a very infamous anarchist, who also felt that he was a redeemer of his people, and he shouted out during his deed, "Hail to him who labors." So he was the one hailing himself as a kind of a redeemer for his people, almost messianic-like. Bobby Sands, it's the Irish redeemer, who was also even depicted in Jesus-like murals on the buildings of Dublin, who self-starved himself in prison through the sacralization of hunger. So this is more a passive kind of martyrdom. So he was not killing other people, he was killing himself because he was confined in prison, but he also channeled the notions of redemption. "A greater love than his hath no man, and he laid down his friend." So, and there was even a priest at his deathbed who cited all these verses. So it's there in the past, but it's very much cemented and very much supported and consolidated in the global jihadist movement, because nowadays, today, it's so much more easier to spread such a concept over the world, to translate it. What also speaks to this, and this is also that's something that came up in the previous discussion, radical redemption. It's not just a belief, it's not just theology, it's a practice. And it's a very appealing practice, because you do something concretely. You pray, you collect goods, you give money, you do zakat. You do something and you get something in return. It's very transactional. And it's very practical and it's very pragmatic and it has a direct result. So it's ideological religious narrative, yes, but it's far more an orthopraxis than an orthodoxy. And it is the actualization, of course, of ideological systems, beliefs that are formulated somewhere, but it's the rituals, the practices, and the performances that matter and that are imbued with a violent and an aggressive meaning. Not always, but oftentimes. Because it's about the fight against evil. And it also has this evil, it's out there, of course, very much so, but it's also the evil in your own life. And it can go very swiftly, and that's also important. If you accept the fact that radical redemption is a narrative, that is perhaps also an orthopraxis, then it's also something that can be embraced in a whim. It can be embraced in a sudden. It's kind of a conversion experience, dark conversion, or however you would like to call it, out of a sudden. It's the suddenly you get it moment. Everything falls into place, one of the interviews said. You have to just surrender yourself, jump into it. And the radicalization occurred also in a very specific point in time, sometimes within a couple of hours. People are on the internet, they look at movies, at clips, and at once they are gripped. Money is wired to them via the internet to go to Duisburg and to take a train ticket and to move to. So it all went very swiftly, which also has, of course, to do with the fact that these people were young people out there also for an adventure. Nothing sort of hindered them. So it could move very swiftly. It's a recurring pattern. Move to act by images, by films, by clips, by YouTube. So it's far more a whole of the body experience than just a cognitive affair. As Abdul Karim Fadil told me, the people on the internet, they gave us answers. They talked back. They were there. It was the best image footage that I ever saw. It was even better than Hollywood. It was slick. It was good. They wanted to join the battlefield. It was just around the corner. You could even say that it's a kind of a gamification. Gamification doesn't mean that games lead you to radicalization. That's not what I mean here. It's that social media practices, as socially imbued by people in this age today, social media practices are also enacted in the real world. So trying to find likes, trying to showcase yourself, trying to reach a next level, become a new avatar, is also something that you can do in real life. Just take the train to Duisburg, fly to Turkey, go to the Caliphate, dress differently, and you're a figure, an action hero in your own computer game. And yes, of course, IS also played with that and even designed specific game materials that played into it. But I'm not saying that gaming leads to radicalization. It's more complex than that. But radical redemption, motivational beliefs, extreme beliefs can also be, how do you say, clad in social media practices. It can also be something practical like that. Very brief example, and I'm nearing my end now. For example, there is this practice of earning hazanat. Hazanat, I already told it during my book presentation, but it's important to highlight once more again here. Hazanat is a standard practice within mainstream Islam of collecting points, good deeds, and things that will be inscribed in your book and that will be used to testify for you later when the day of the final judgment is there. And ordinary Muslim youngsters, they held each other accountable. They also discussed the fact, how much points can you get for this. And if you look it up on Google or on Twitter or what have you, you can just Google and fill in Hazanat. You'll find all kinds of practices where people negotiate, can I earn more points when it's Ramadan? If I do this, how many points will I get? Will they be distracted? Can I also earn points for others? So all these very mundane discussions, but they were appropriated by IS. They were appropriated by jihadists, appropriated by radical youngsters who kind of challenged each other in earning more points by doing more radical deeds. So you can imagine that going to Syria, going to Iraq, joining the battle, it's old-fashioned martyrdom, becoming a martyr for Allah, but it's more than that. All these different segments of actions are already being rewarded with points. And then IS, again, the meso level makes great propaganda out of this. So you see a picture of someone who died during the battle, and then he is kind of portrayed on a pedestal he's sanctified after his death, and IS uses this person's life and death as a kind of recruitment material for new jihadist youngsters. After sacrificing his wealth, he also sacrificed his life for the sake of Allah, and he's now redeemed. Collecting this all together, bringing it in the system, what you can see happening is that there are different kinds of redemptive beliefs and practices. There's the individual redemptive belief. It's about personal guilt, personal atonement, personal gratification. It can also be more collective. So it's either revenge or altruistic dedication in the struggle against collective injustice for your community. So it's more the purification of others, redeeming others, than only necessarily yourself. And I'm not going into this detail now, but you can see that there are different types of redemptive narratives emerge. The religious individual one, the political collective one, the repenting zealot, the revenging zealot, the political altruist, the soul-searching. So you see that we already had this before. Every individual that joined the jihadist battle has a different story to tell. It's not that they all are completely different. There is a set of narratives, but it's varies per person, per type of person, per temperament, of course, and I try to account for that as well. So, concluding remarks. What brings us this? What insights can we draw when we take religious beliefs seriously, when we ask the terrorist convicts themselves, and if we subscribe to the hypothesis that it's social appraisals, radical behavior, and religious beliefs that needs to be combined in a framework. What brings us this? Well, first of all, much more research needs to be done on bringing these various angles and disciplines together. On the religious content of redemption narratives, on the psychological content of redemption, on the question whether this also is at work with convicted right-wing terrorists. I had a couple of conversations with right-wing terrorists and interviews, which I also worked into my book, but that should be done in far more detail as well, because the right-wing terrorists also told me about wanting to redeem their loser lives, wanting to redeem their society, get rid of impure elements. They also felt called and felt chosen, and they also felt that some were even very apocalyptical in the way they formulated their motivational beliefs, and they also saw themselves almost in prophetical terms. So here's also something to discover. And it's also, with Kavanaugh, I think we have to admit it's difficult to distinguish between sacred and religious motivational beliefs. So what exactly is the religious aspect? Just the fact that there is a huge religious community out there that has existed for so many centuries, so that it has a very strong set of narratives. So is it more a quantitative? Is it more a question of weight rather than of content? That's a very important question. Second question, the second point is, as I said, we need to bridge the gap between religious studies, social psychology, philosophy, history. Radicalization studies are too empty. It's too empty. It's too much public administration, security oriented. So we need more qualitative, creative studies bridging this gap. We also need to have more research on the drivers of apocalyptical belief systems. What is religious, what is sacred, what is apocalyptical. And my last point, and that's perhaps my most important point being an historian, with Gergen we hold that historical processes are necessary to understand how social psychological mechanisms, how philosophical concepts, how they march through time. So if you take the concept of narrative seriously, that is an historical concept. It's a story that's being told. It's about facts that follow upon each other, perceived facts, of course. So a narrative is in itself something that requires time to be told, time to be enacted. So it has a certain sequence to it. And I think oftentimes social psychological explanations, perhaps also religious or philosophical explanations, I'm not sure, they're too generic, they're too abstract perhaps, and they do not take into account how context matters and how groups that radicalize develop new kinds of reward systems, transactional systems to make sense of what's happening to them. So also the narrative may change because of that. So that's perhaps my most important message. A narrative is a story. It flows to time. It leads us to specific stages. And it can also lead us into this place where there's no escape left than to act violently, radically. So it's just a series of events that makes you do these terrible things. You didn't set out to do them. You didn't intend to murder other people. But it's the series of events, the desire to find redemption that leads it to you. So what does that mean for dealing with extreme mindset and extreme beliefs? Perhaps the mindset didn't start as extreme or as radical. It only got there in the end. So finishing with that question, and also hoping that there will be more research in bridging these gaps, I would like to conclude this lecture, and thank you for your attention.